Yet another mass shooting in the United States, and this one is the worst. It's way too early to draw conclusions from the killing of dozens at a country music concert from the window of a Las Vegas casino hotel, but we're going to take a look at the circumstances, what we know so far about the 64-year-old Nevada resident who turned one of his semi-automatic weapons on himself after at least 10 minutes of carnage. It's the latest such a spree in a long, long list. The U.S. president earlier reading a somber address from the White House where he announced he'd be traveling to Las Vegas on Wednesday, the first big mass shooting on Donald Trump's watch, testing what kind of president he is, also testing the community in Las Vegas and the United States. Welcome to this special edition of the France 24 debate. And joining us will be joined from Washington by Eric Lisson, former U.S. federal prosecutor. With us from Berlin, Yann Saint-Pierre, the CEO of modern security consulting group Mosicon. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
Here in the studio, France 24's Wasim Nasser is with us, and so is Emma James. The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Also, we could say hello to one more guest, which is Matthias Schwartz, contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine. Thank you for being with us from Washington. The first task at hand right now in Las Vegas is tending to the hundreds of wounded, an appeal for blood donations launched by the mayor. Julia Seeger has more.
The sun is rising on Las Vegas' famous strip, and the heavy police presence is a reminder of the carnage that took place here just hours ago. The worst mass shooting in U.S. history.
And though we feel such great anger at the senseless murder of our fellow citizens, it is our love that defines us today and always will, forever. In times such as these, I know we are searching for some kind of meaning in the chaos, some kind of light in the darkness. The answers do not come easy.
At around 10 p.m. on Sunday, a country music concert was in full swing when suddenly automatic gunfire. A crowd of 40,000 people, some running, some taking cover, some hit. Law enforcement swarmed the scene, shutting down the city's main strip. They then quickly spotted the shooter on the 32nd floor of the Mandalay Bay Hotel and blasted their way into the room. The assailant, identified as 64-year-old local resident Stephen Paddock, killed himself prior to their entry.
As far as his history and background, we haven't completed that part of the investigation yet, but we located numerous firearms within the room that he occupied.
Police say they believe the assailant acted as a lone wolf. Two of his homes in northern Nevada are being raided to help explain his motive. Meanwhile, the attack was claimed by the Islamic State group, who says Paddock converted to Islam several months ago, an information some U.S. officials deny.
And let me begin with you, Emma James. The shooter from a community some 80 miles outside of Las Vegas.
Yes, absolutely, and very much not the kind of profile that we would expect if indeed it were linked to the Islamic State group. And it's not just the US officials who are a little skeptical about this. Lots of people online, the Associated Press, in fact, when they released this information, they prefaced it with the words, "without providing evidence." The Islamic State group claims the Las Vegas attack says the shooter converted to Islam months ago. Now, they haven't provided any kind of proof whatsoever to sort of back up their claims, and a lot of people very, very uncertain as to the veracity of it. If we look elsewhere in the media, with more information coming out about Stephen Paddock, 64 years old, retired in a quiet little spot in the desert in Mesquite, as you say, about 80 miles or so from Las Vegas. The Clark County Sheriff, Joseph Lombardo, described him as basically said we have no idea what his belief system was, and certainly they have found nothing to suggest any kind of link at all. There's also no criminal record for this man. There's been some talk of the fact that he was in some way known to authorities, but he doesn't have a criminal record. We do know that much. Looking elsewhere, the Chicago Tribune reporting on this one, saying that he liked to gamble, listened to country music, lived a quiet, retired life before the massacre. All that fits in with being in Las Vegas, of course, if he was interested in gambling. And also, he checked in on September the 28th, a few days before, obviously, this was carried out. It was a 3-day concert that was going on, country music concert, at the 3-day Route 91 Harvest Country Music Festival. So everything suggests that he had gone along to watch that. Nobody at this moment in time has any idea what his motives may have been. Now, interestingly, his brother has been located. His brother lives in Orlando, and he has given various interviews speaking very much of his own shock, weeping as he talked about his brother. As it says here, it's like an asteroid just fell on top of our family, he said. Now, he's called Eric. He's 55 years old. He says the whole family is completely dumbfounded. When talking about the fact that he supposedly had 10 weapons in his hotel room, he said he might have had a gun or two, but he had no idea that there was this weapons cache. He talked about the fact that, as far as he knew, his brother had no religious or political affiliations. There is no reason we can imagine why Stephen would do something like this. He's just a guy with no serious health or money problems. Apparently he had enough money to comfortably live out the rest of his days. He describes him as just a guy who lived in Mesquite and liked burritos.
Yann Saint-Pierre, what's the first conclusion that you draw from what happened?
My first reaction was really to think back to Columbine and Sandy Hook and a lot of the unfortunate massacres or mass shootings that occurred throughout U.S. history. This has happened so often, especially over the last 30 years, that I wasn't thinking terrorism at first. I was really thinking more, this is another one. This is another case where, like Charles Whitman in the Clock Tower shooter 50 years ago, almost to the day, this is another case, typical situation of a mass shooting in U.S. history. Now, over the course of the day, the affiliation, the claim with IS, I have my own doubts. But for me, what I see right now, it almost fits the classic profile of an American mass shooter, what we've seen over the last 30 years.
The classic profile of an American mass shooter. We're joined by former federal prosecutor Eric Lisson. Do you agree?
Well, the profile so far does seem to fit exactly what we've seen in some of these other horrific shootings in U.S. history. If we go back, the Aurora, Colorado shootings and unfortunately many of these others, he seems to be a guy that has lived by himself or with very few people. There's no indication that he's held any sort of political beliefs or what his grievance was. He's stockpiled a lot of weapons, and then, as his family indicates, out of the blue, something like this happens, and nobody has any explanation for it. There does seem to be that profile.
Seems to be that profile, and the FBI, as Emma James was pointing out, saying that this claim of responsibility by ISIS that was floated on one of its affiliated websites, so far bearing no fruits.
Apparently, it's common that ISIS, in what we've seen, ISIS does claim the majority of these types of incidents, but that fits their ideological mindset and their desire to instill terror. Obviously, a lot more investigation has to be done until we can determine what actually is going on here. There's a great deal that is unknown at this time.
Let's listen to what the FBI said a short while ago.
As this event unfolds, we have determined to this point no connection with an international terrorist group. As this investigation continues, we will continue to work with our partners to ensure that this is factually, thoroughly, and absolutely investigated to be able to bring comfort and peace back to this community.
Wasim Nasser, you have been seeing how jihadist websites have evolved over the years. You pay careful attention in 3 languages to what you monitor, what's going on. What have you found today?
Actually, what I've seen over the years is they usually don't claim what they're not doing. There have been usually there have been some exaggerations, like for the claim, for example, for the attacks in Barcelona, where they talked about 2 crews and a kidnapping situation in a bar. And we know that they took these information from the media and they exaggerated what happened in Barcelona, because there was no kidnapping situation, there were no 2 crews, it was one and the same crew. And we have doubts about some claims, like the claim of Manila, the attack of a casino in Manila, where they say it was one of their soldiers, and the Manilan authorities said, no, he's a gambler. So, and they were, in their journal in Arabic, they said that bombs were paused in the Paris airport, and it wasn't true.
Up until recently, you were always emphatic, saying when they claim something, it's usually pretty accurate on this website. What's the name of the website again? It's
Amaq. There's Amaq and there's Nashr. There's two media outlets that they have, and up to this point,
are things changing?
It would be a really big first today. If this claim is totally false, it will be a first. Because as I told you, there's some exaggerations sometimes on other things like Manila. On other occasions like Manila, we have big doubts. But today, for them to claim something big like this in Las Vegas, it would be a first. And just let me tell you one more thing. They already claimed 2 attacks in the United States, one of Orlando, of course, the gay bar attack with 2 Pakistanis, and an attack that occurred in Texas against cartoonists. It was a failed attack, and they claimed it despite the fact that it was failed. And on the 2 cases, the American authorities said that there was no link with the Islamic State. So what we have to imagine today is the link isn't forcibly physical. The link can be virtual. The link can be from someone who knows someone in the ranks of the Islamic State, either in Syria or Iraq or elsewhere, because the attacker of Manchester, his links were to Libya. And we know today, for example, that a media operator of the Islamic State was living in Germany, and he got arrested by the German authorities a few months ago. So we have to be more imaginative, I guess, in this kind of process.
Yann Saint-Pierre?
I agree. I would also add to one of the examples that Mr. Nasser explained is the case of Tiaret in Algeria a few weeks ago. Actually, 2 competing groups, ISIS and the new form, the JNM or NIM in French, claimed the attack, the suicide bombing in Algeria, which sort of adds to the doubts that one could have now as who, is this opportunistic? Is it actually based, whether it's virtual, whether it's direct? I agree that usually there's always a base of evidence that for them to claim it. And the investigation will bring about the evidence that there was indeed a link. But I think over the last few months, there have been some cracks or breaches within that credibility that IS has with its claims of terrorist attacks.
Yeah, breaches in the past months, you say, and that's something, of course, we'll watch, and we have to be very cautious at this particular point in time. Matthias Schwartz, let me just ask you, because when the Orlando shooting happened here in Paris, we were stunned. 49 people killed. And now, are we getting used to sort of an, excuse me for saying this, kind of almost, it's becoming, routine is perhaps too strong a word, but commonplace?
Oh no, I think you're absolutely right. I think that the bar has gotten lower and lower in terms of what the American people are willing to swallow. I'm sure there will be a few days of shock and horror after this, but we had Columbine, we had Sandy Hook, we had the shooting of members of Congress while they were practicing baseball. And at this point, it would be foolish for anyone to suggest, just given the track record of the American public, that this is something that it always feels unprecedented right after it happens. But just looking over the past, it's clear that Americans have the ability to process these events and move on without making any substantive change to policy.
I sense resignation in your voice.
Yeah, I did absolutely. Just sort of looking over what's happened over the last few years, it's clear that as a group, the American people, and I'm one of them, want to preserve the status quo in terms of everyday people being able to go out and buy, weapons, often as many as they like, depending on the state, that have magazine capacity and can fire, high-powered rounds from a great distance away. There have been many opportunities like this one where you would think that we would see change, particularly Sandy Hook, where you had more than 20 children killed in their own school by a minor. It hasn't happened, and I don't see why it would happen now.
Eric Lisson, at the outset of the show, we heard Yann St-Pierre allude to the shooting 51 years ago, the Texas Clock Tower shooting at the University of Texas, where a former Marines sharpshooter, over the space of more than an hour and a half, killed 18 people. Of course, he didn't have semi-automatic weapons in those days. Is it really the way that you just heard it described there by Matthias Schwartz? There'll be an argument for a few days, and then, well, we'll move on in the United States?
Well, the depressing reality is that has sort of been the pattern. I mean, that's, I think, somewhat exaggerated, but there's always a sense that this is the event after each one of these incidents that will finally spark some sort of legislation or some sort of gun control measures, that will, in the minds of many people, address this type of incident. But then it never happens. And in fact, what has happened, if anything, is the movement has been in the opposite direction. We're really much more, I think, collectively, or in terms of, say, the Republican Party or the party controlling, the machinery of government in most jurisdictions, in a situation where the mindset is we have to have more weapons. We have to arm everybody, and that's the only way to keep everybody safe. So to the extent that we're sort of neither in a situation where everybody wants to walk around carrying a firearm, or in a situation where these arms are proscribed, nor are we in a situation where even somebody can walk into a Las Vegas hotel with 10 rifles capable of inflicting great damage, that actually nothing happens, other than there seems to be a sentiment that gets more strongly and more strongly held among a part of the electorate. Now, it may very well be a minority, but among a part of the electorate, and certainly the president is catering to this part of the electorate in terms of invoking the Second Amendment all the time, that feels that we have to be heavily armed. I remember back in the 70s, there was a TV show, a very famous television show called All in the Family, and there was an episode devoted to this, and the main character, Archie Bunker, went on TV to express his view that in terms of preventing airline hijackings, for example, he had the solution. That was to arm all the passengers. At that time, it was felt that solution was ridiculous, and it was held out as a satire. But I think today, for many, many people, that is more sensible.
Today it's taken seriously.
It's a more sensible solution.
Eric, we have to take a quick break. We'll be right back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're looking at breaking news out of Las Vegas, the worst mass shooting in U.S. history. Dozens killed, hundreds injured. With us to talk about it is Yann St-Pierre, CEO of Modern Security Consulting, who joins us from Berlin. In Washington, Eric Lisson, a former U.S. federal prosecutor. Welcome back to the show as well. Also in the U.S. Capitol, Matthias Schwartz, contributing writer to the New York Times Magazine. And here in the studio, France 24's Emma James. The U.S. president tweeting a somber tweet from him expressing his sympathies. Maybe you can call up that tweet. Have you got it there?
I have it right here.
Let's have a look at that before.
Yes, my warmest condolences and sympathies to the victims and families of the terrible Las Vegas shooting. God bless you, he tweeted. But what is interesting to note is that in comparison to his reactions to other terror attacks, certainly the ones in London where he was very, very quick to react online on social media, it was actually a good 5 hours after we knew that this was happening that he actually took to social media to make his comments.
Yeah, and it was a somber tone we heard from the U.S. president as he read from his prepared statement from the White House shortly after 10:30 a.m. local time.
I will be visiting Las Vegas on Wednesday to meet with law enforcement, first responders, and the families of the victims. In moments of tragedy and horror, America comes together as one.
Matthias Schwartz, what did you think of Trump's statement?
Well, he didn't talk about, the shooter at all. He didn't talk about the guns. And I think it is very striking that when there have been these international instances of terrorism coming from ISIS, the president has had no problem speculating about the causes, talking about the perpetrator, talking about the motive, trying to put himself in their mind, calling them, losers, calling them loser terrorists repeatedly. And I think it's interesting that in this case, he would choose to show comparative restraint when the numbers of victims are so much higher. And I can only guess as to why that is.
Why is that?
I don't know. He's definitely someone who plays these things from the gut. I think the profile of this individual appears to be something closer to, the base of people, the minority of people in the United States who are fervent supporters of the president. And I also think he's not, it appears that he isn't ready, as our previous president was, to talk about the issue of gun control in this country, even though it's hard to imagine a set of circumstances that would make that more urgent or push it further, to the forefront, especially after, a senior Republican congressman, was nearly shot to death by someone else with a high-powered rifle in the Capitol earlier this year. But at this point, it looks like President Trump doesn't want to touch it.
Eric Clisson, could this be a seminal moment for Donald Trump?
All of these incidents we feel could be seminal moments, and then things develop in a way that I think nobody can predict. So, certainly it's possible, but it's hard to say what's going to happen. I think it will be interesting to watch his reaction, has been alluded to here already, in terms of how he's going to handle the gun issue. Historically, he's always been very, very pro-guns, so to speak. After the last horrific incident, which was not that long ago, the shooting of Representative Scalise, which, while the congressmen were playing baseball, some of the storyline that emerged was that it was good that he had an armed guard with him that saved everybody's life, and it was just coincidental. I don't know whether the president is going to seize on that particular factoid and then say, this is why we have to cater more to the gun base and do more to assure gun rights? Or is he going to strike out and make a deal with the Democrats all of a sudden and say, here, let's get some comprehensive gun reform legislation? I think it's early to say that. Everybody wants to say that it could be a seminal moment, but there's so many things happening there, and there's so many other things in the pipeline that we don't have time to get into here that could change all of that, we're just looking at a cloud of uncertainty.
A cloud of uncertainty. We're looking at live images of the room on the 32nd floor that was broken there by the gunman when he started his shooting spree. Yann Saint-Pierre, full disclosure, you hail from north of the U.S. border. What are the thoughts, first of all, on the tone you heard from the U.S. president this Monday?
Well, the tone obviously was a very restrained tone. I think as one of your co-debaters mentioned, it felt usually he speaks from the gut and he reacts from the gut. I think he had more choice words for what happened. You could feel it was very restrained. He tried to maintain high levels of dignity, to maintain a sort of level of composure and control, which is almost out of character but deeply necessary at this point in time. So whether or not that's really a good sign of things to come and how to address the issue, that remains open. But for now, without necessarily going into detail, just the fact that he stayed on script for the situation probably denotes the level of seriousness he takes this issue with.
Yeah, he made a speech where he essentially said, or read a statement where he said, let's not jump to conclusions. And I suppose because it's only been hours that you have to applaud him for that.
You do, but you can also say that this is the man who jumps to conclusions every time that there is a terror attack or any kind of incident that could possibly be a terror attack in other countries. So I'm not sure that he deserves too much plaudits for finally applying the kind of the normal rules of engagement, if you like, for a politician who is dealing with something that is very much in the early stages of the investigation. There is no clear steer other than this supposed claim that he has links to the Islamic State group. Other than that, we have no clues. His brother has provided no clues. Nothing that was found within the hotel, as we've been told so far, has provided any clues either. The other thing that people are talking about, in particular with regards to Donald Trump, is the fact that his language has been so much more muted and they're not viewing that in a positive way. This particular Twitter user says, "I am still waiting for Donald Trump to call Stephen Paddock, this the man who carried out the shooting, a son of a bee. Like he did those football players. What happened in Las Vegas was an act."
He called it an act of pure evil, though.
He did, but you have to say that it's not the same kind of rhetoric, not the same level of anger and accusation, really. And he talks about the fact that it was an act of domestic terrorism by a domestic white male terrorist. Now, other people on Twitter are pointing out this. You're ready to ban a whole people of a certain religion from entering your country, but you can't even ban automatic weapons and extended clips. So lots of people seeing some hypocrisy in what Donald Trump has been saying. James Melville, another Twitter user, talking about the fact that for him, the biggest threat in America is not people from afar. The biggest threat in America is easy access to guns. But whether anything will change as a result of this, Newsweek has jumped very much in with both feet to stipulate straight away that Trump will not change gun control laws after this shooting. And what they talk about in particular is back in April, Donald Trump addressed the NRA. He told them then that they had a true friend and champion in the White House. Newsweek, for one, says nothing is going to change. People often say we shouldn't politicize these kind of tragedies too soon, but certainly political people and politicians are getting involved very quickly. Hillary Clinton has been tweeting about this. Our grief is not enough, she says. We can and must put politics aside, stand up to the NRA and work together to try to stop this from happening again.
Yann Saint-Pierre, Canadians like to crow that they too have a gun culture, but they don't have a mass shooting culture. Why is that?
Well, there is a mass shooting culture. Unfortunately, we saw it again in January of this year with Alexandre Bissonnette shooting 6 people in a mosque. Denis Lortie 30 years ago, Marc Lépine in 1989, the University of Montreal shooting. There is a mass shooting culture, but I think the idea that a gun is necessary for, almost everywhere is it's just not that present. I think there's a sense of security that prevails in Canada that plays a big role in this, that there's not you don't feel threatened, but it is changing. There is, it is a big debate. A lot of people are saying, well, there's this East Coast, West Coast difference, and even the middle of the country. So it's a hot debate as well over there. But I would like to go even further in terms of the gun control issue, just to break it down in more of a common sense. Why is it possible to enter one of Las Vegas's most prominent hotels with 10 rifles without setting off metal detectors, with that being allowed? For me, that's just common sense. You're letting people enter a public area with weapons, and I've go through in hotels around the world, and every time there's a lot of metal detectors, weapons are forbidden, and that's just common sense. Weapons are dangerous, and so without going too deep into the full gun control issue, I would say again, why are weapons allowed in venues like hotels?
Eric Lisson, as a former federal prosecutor, is this to do with the gun culture, or how do you explain this problem? Or does it have to do as well with maybe the way the United States is set up, where states often have final say on what those rules are?
Well, it's a good and a complicated question, and all of those things play a role in it. I would add that, ironically, I think the United States is more to the right, let's say, more pro-guns now than at any point in its history, and that, you know, includes the proverbial era of the Wild West. There were restrictions out on the western frontier where, from a common sense perspective, you know, people understood that people shouldn't have access to loaded firearms under certain circumstances. Right now, the debate doesn't really talk about what those circumstances are, the general consensus. The guiding sort of Republican or conservative or right-wing talking point is that guns are necessary for security. There's never a talk about limits, because it's felt that once you talk about limits, you're talking about the demise of American freedoms and liberties. So I think we're actually much more to the right than we've ever been as a country on this issue. Whether the pendulum will ever swing back is a difficult decision. Obviously, I think if the presidential election had turned out differently, the debate would be different. But right now, the United States has elected a president through its sort of peculiar electoral college process that was elected in part because he was very much to the right on these issues. But it is a polarizing debate, because I would say, you know, roughly that, you know, at least 50% of the electorate feels strongly that we're in the wrong direction on this, while the other 50% feels we should be, you know, more extreme and that we need guns. So it's a very difficult situation.
Matthias Schwartz, is it too simplistic to say that, well, this is just down to excellent lobbying efforts by the pro-gun lobby?
Yeah, I do think that is too simplistic. Despite vigorous attempts to interpret it to the contrary, my reading of the Second Amendment of the U.S. Constitution is that it offers pretty robust rights for people to keep and bear arms. And it says that the government, you know, that's a right and that it shall not be infringed. And I think there's a limit to the extent to which you're going to be able to legislate around that, as long as it's in the plain English of the Constitution. Beyond the constitutional issue, you've also got, you know, a very deep-grained libertarian culture in the U.S. where people do not want the government up in their business. You know, I've written a little bit about, you know, gun clubs and gun groups in the past, and people see the right to own a firearm, not just any firearm, but very powerful firearms, as a kind of final check on the government's authority to mess with them. Now, how realistic that is in the state of modern warfare, you know, it isn't. But people do see a minority of the population, but a very well-armed minority, see guns as a kind of throwback to the country's revolutionary origins, which they see as a right to do what you want and not have the government around bothering you about it.
Not have the government around bothering you about it. Matthias Schwartz, when you heard Eric Lisson talk about an increasingly polarized United States. Where is it all going? Because statistics seem to show that the number of these mass shootings is growing.
Well, yeah, I think that's true. But as a statistical number of gun fatalities in the United States, these mass shootings are actually, you know, they're horrifying. And I think that they don't get an undue amount of media attention at all. I think they deserve the attention. But the majority of gun deaths are suicides. If you take out the suicides, the majority of the rest are African Americans killing other African Americans with handguns in cities. And then the majority of the people who are lobbying and who are vigorously in favor of gun rights are people who are far away from where all that's happening. They're people who want the right to own rifles, often high-powered rifles, out in the country. And you know, there's a few nuances to it, and I'm painting with a pretty broad brush here. But part of the challenge we're facing is that the people who feel that they derive a benefit from gun ownership are not the same people who are feeling the negative effects of how easy it is to get your hands on one of these weapons.
Eric Lisson, this concept that Matthias Schwartz is talking about, this libertarian concept of individuals' rights above all, get the government off my back. It applies to not just gun rights. It also applies to whether or not the federal government should be more involved in mental health issues, because obviously somebody who wants to carry out this kind of carnage has mental health problems. That's the one conclusion we can draw from what happened in Las Vegas.
Yes, absolutely. And that's another area where legislation has been proposed or efforts have been proposed to try to mobilize some sort of targeting and treatment of people who might suffer from these conditions. But that also is very complicated, and the current political environment maybe doesn't lend itself to these sort of nuanced discussions. And of course, on the one hand, it takes more resources, financial and otherwise, at the state and the federal level. But we have to decide, what level of reporting is necessary by others, what level of intrusion into somebody's otherwise private life might be justified. And the fact is that even with all that, maybe some of these gunmen, perhaps the one today, we just don't know anything really about the shooter today, or last night rather. But would he have been identified? His own family is saying there was nothing amiss. Would anybody else have been able to say that? With even a more aggressive, so to speak, system of identifying people who are mentally ill, which surely is a problem, would that have identified him? We just don't know. And the difficulty of this, I think, is exemplified by the quote of the sheriff, which he said, "I just don't know what we could have done to prevent this. Based on what I know now, I just don't know." I think a lot of people, unfortunately, are going to take that approach, even though there are other measures that should and need to be implemented.
Emma James?
Well, Eric, they're talking about the fact that mental illness undoubtedly is likely to have played a part in this. But one person who tweets a great deal, it has to be said, against Donald Trump, Michael Jollett, has pointed this out. For those of you saying this was a case of mental illness, remember this was one of the first things Trump did. Back in February, just a little over a month after he took the reins of power, as it were, he actually undid an Obama-era regulation which made it harder for people with mental health problems to get their hands on guns. Now, this undoubtedly is something that is going to be discussed a great deal in the coming weeks, because overturning something like that, if this gentleman does turn out to have had mental health issues that perhaps would have meant he couldn't have got his hands on those guns so easily, it is a lot of ifs and buts and maybes right now. But at this moment in time, a lot of people asking questions about whether that should have been allowed to happen.
Yeah, this this issue of mental health is an important one, and also the fact that Yann Saint-Pierre, this shooting happened in the United States. It's playing out on the world stage. We're talking about it here on France 24. The rest of the world is watching this. And with these shootings happening more and more, does it affect the psyche of people, well, around the planet?
Well, first of all, I always think about, to relate to what was said previously, one of the most common phrases or statements right after a terrorist attack occurs, a shooting occurs, or a serial killer is identified, he was such a great neighbor. In terms of, it's always like, I never thought this was possible. It was a great gardener. It was, so identifying people with such issues is not only complicated, it's near impossible, because there's also a part of normalcy. We don't necessarily see everybody as a threat, and that plays a role. As for the international psyche and the effect it has, of course it does. We see it, when there are terrorist attacks on beaches. The effect, that tourists try to avoid certain areas that are identified as, former terrorist hotspots. Paris has been hit for tourism because of all the attacks. Many places around Europe, around the world have been attacked. So it does play a role. But again, it comes down to common sense. You always go somewhere thinking you might get shot, you might become injured, or you go somewhere and realize the odds of that actually happening are very slow. But it's very difficult in this day and age with all the available information, right or wrong, with facts that are right or wrong, and all the visual content. It's very difficult to stay a bit more rational and calm ourselves down, whereas we're surrounded by a flow of negative information, and that does have an impact on our psyche.
Matthias Schwartz, in view of what you just heard from Yann Saint-Pierre, how do you cover these kinds of events?
Well, that pattern is pretty well established. Usually there's a lot of focus on the shooter, who is the shooter, what was their motive, what can we find in their biography that'll provide some kind of explanation for this act that's inexplicable. Then there's also, the victims and the harm that was caused, and then there's usually, a search for some sort of hero or act of defiance within the overwhelming tragedy that will give people a sense of solace. So that's what the norm is now. Whether, and I'm not sure. I'm not really sure how else you can cover something like this because like an act of terrorism, the root cause of it takes place within an individual conscience, and if that individual is dead, it's very hard to put a why on what happened, and so the media is sort of left grasping at straws.
Emma James?
Just very briefly, one rather unusual, enlightening thing that we are discovering now. Eric Paddock, the brother of Stephen Paddock, has revealed in interviews that their father actually was a bank robber on the FBI's 10 most wanted bank robbers list. Not to say that apples don't fall far from the tree, but certainly that's a lot of people on Twitter reflecting that idea that if you have a criminal parent, then you could possibly follow in their footsteps. It may be a bit of a stretch, but that certainly does appear to be true according to what we are seeing online and what we've heard from Eric Paddock, the brother of Stephen.
All right, many thanks, Emma James. I want to thank our panelists, Yann Saint-Pierre, for joining us from Berlin, Eric Lisson and Matthias Schwartz in Washington, and our thoughts going out for all of those in Las Vegas right now. Again, hundreds injured there. The Eiffel Tower, by the way, going dark this Monday evening in tribute to the community in Las Vegas. Stay with us. There's more to come here on France 24.